I'll pull up my pocket version here.
1,000-page omnibus bills that nobody knows what's in it. Hello and welcome to a fourth season of the Omnibus Podcast, Minnesota's best weekly breakdown of political news inside and outside the Capitol. I'm your host, Jeremy Munson, political activist and former state representative from southern Minnesota, and as usual, we're joined by Representative Walter Hudson, who's about to enter the second half of his first two-year term in the Minnesota House of Representatives. On today's show, I'd like to bring our listeners up to speed on tracking the Democrats' top agenda items for this year as the legislative session begins in the next few days. In order to do that and to keep in line with the show's purpose, it'll also be important to offer a 50,000-foot view of the legislative process, explaining what the committee deadlines are, time frames, and to understand how our listeners can be most effective in advocating for or against these proposed legislation. Before we jump into the nuts and bolts of watching the Democrats dismantle our republic, Walter and I like to just discuss what we've been doing since the last show season, in a term known in the Capitol as the interim, to talk about how we've been spending our time. Since leaving the legislature last January, I've chosen to remain involved with a few groups whose mission I support. The Legislative Evaluation Assembly, the LEA, scores bills and creates legislative scorecards. I've long appreciated the work that they do and offered to be on the board to help choose bills and to score them. You can find their scorecard at lea-mn.org. It's a group I really enjoy meeting with. I've also kind of re-engaged with the Minnesota Republican Party. I became a state central delegate, one of about 300 Minnesotans who run the operations of the party. For better or worse, the party's kind of broken and turmoil, and I think it fails at messaging, but you can criticize how they've been attacking conservatives, but either you get involved and try to change the party from within, or you just lob grenades from the outside. So I chose to re-engage with them. I also served on the board of the Republican Liberty Caucus for many years, and it's a political action organization that's dedicated to promoting individual liberty and limited government, free market economics. In Minnesota, the chapter is actually an affiliate of the state party. And so I took over as chair of the Minnesota RLC and been hopefully getting involved with some legislation that we can promote that would pass under bipartisan or under Democrat control, really. And we'll see what happens this year with that. But you can go out to their website. I think it's rlc.org. is the website of the Republican Liberty Caucus. I also volunteer as a board member for the Citizens Council for Health Freedom, or cchfreedom.org. And this group is a nonprofit that continues to advocate for free market healthcare policy and parental rights. They were very important during COVID. Walter, you were one of my guests at the annual gala with Pete Hegseth. And it's a really great organization. And finally, I serve on the board of the Mankato Center of the American Experiment chapter, where we work to educate the public on a wide array of issues and debunk many of the propaganda programs spread by the left. A lot of you are familiar with the American Experiment, americanexperiment.org. They're a great group, and we need them in Minnesota as a kind of a weapon against the radical left. On a personal level, we've moved to a different house on our property, and I've spent like a ton of time doing construction projects, renovation, and putting an addition on our house. So just spent a lot of time working on construction stuff. And then, of course, my full-time job doing consulting for mostly financial service firms that I've been working full-time and doing that. So I've been keeping busy. My daughters are busy in volleyball and basketball, so following them around, taking pictures for the team, and getting my wood shop fired up again after years of being dormant in the legislature and doing some woodworking. So that's what I enjoy, and that's what I've been doing to keep myself busy. Walter, what have you been doing since session?
Yeah, the interim has been an extremely jarring experience for me, and people tried to warn me going into it that it was going to be that way, that going from the particular chaos of the legislative session back to quote unquote real life was going to be quite an aggressive culture shock. But even with all those warnings, I wasn't prepared for it. My day job has been being an operations manager for a small business involved in logistics. And prior to running That was my full-time occupation. It occupied much of my bandwidth, at times all of my bandwidth, depending on the time of year. And that was fine before I was a legislator. It was even fine when I was running the first time around. I was able to juggle it and make it work. But in the interim, it became very, very challenging to try, because there's all these expectations. People think, oh, it's a part-time legislature. You're only in session for a minority of the year. And that's true. Less than half the year we're actually in session, but that's not all that a legislator does, especially if they're actually going to try to represent their community. You have to be engaging. You have to be talking to people, holding meetings, getting out there, talking to people. And that takes time, setting meetings. And the nature of the job that I had was such that, if an emergency presents itself, which often occurred in this position that requires managerial intervention, there goes the next 3 hours, and it could happen at the drop of a hat at any time. And so there were a number of meetings that I had scheduled that I would have to cancel, and it was just kind of a chaotic experience. And so I made the decision about halfway through interim that it was unsustainable, and I was going to have to find another job. Um, but that process ended up being a lot sloppier than I would have preferred. And so basically where things have landed is that I just within the last month finally stepped away from that position, and I'm getting ready to go back into session. And so, right now I'm basically functioning as a full-time legislator with the part-time pay of just doing this job. And I've never been happier. Like, I love the work of engaging on issues and talking to people about what they care about, and looking ahead to, strategically how we're going to handle what the Democrats have in store this year. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah. Well, I'm sorry to hear that your full-time gig didn't jive with being a legislator. As you look across the Minnesota legislature, many of the Democrats most of the Democrats are full-time legislators, and maybe they have a paid position on a board that they serve on, especially the nonprofits, and especially the ones that get money from the legislature. Huge conflict of interest. Just to clarify, all the boards that I serve on, it's completely volunteer. I'm not paid for my time. And in I see that as a conflict of interest if you're a legislator. But I want to donate my time. But it's challenging, and it's difficult to explain to voters that it is a part-time job. Yes, it does pay, $40,000-$50,000 a year, something like that. But it's your amount of time that you spend should be a lot, right? You should be spending 1,000, 1,500 hours a year doing your legislative job, even though you're paid for this small, time that you're in session. Now, that being said, a lot of the Republicans and Democrats only really work when they're in session. And if you wanted to be, an autopilot cruise control legislator, just to do the bare minimum, you don't even have to show up for session. You're not going to get fired. You might not get reelected, but you don't have to actually show up for session at all. But there's legislators out there that don't do anything in the interim, and they just reprint stuff from the caucus, and it's sad to see. I was in your boat. I was trying to do the most of advocating for change and promoting conservative principles at the legislature, and that meant going around and going to all these meetings and BPOU meetings. I represented 4 different counties, 20 towns. They all had city council meetings and township board meetings and stuff. There's a lot of stuff that you can go to. And then because I was seen as a legislator who was actually doing more than many of them, I was invited to speak at a lot of the BPOU meetings outside of my district. I was driving, going up to northern Minnesota and speaking to groups of people. And if you want to, and you get drawn into that because you're like, well, our rep hasn't done anything. Would you come and speak to our group? And, and then people get upset because, hey, you were talking to my BPOU. It's like,
Yep.
well, because you won't
Yep.
go, And so you get drawn into that as being one of those people that, it's out there just fighting for conservatives. And I see you as one of those as well.
Yeah, and listen, it has been like, there's so many learning experiences with this position that it's learning through doing. It's not because anybody tells you. Like, there's so many things. Like, I could probably write a book, and maybe one day I will, of the things that are essential to know as a legislator that nobody tells you for whatever reason. And one of those things is exactly what you're talking about, is that, if you're engaging beyond your district, with a broader community of conservatives, then yeah, you're going to get invited to stuff. You're going to get invited to this thing over here, that thing over there. I've been doing this thing with Representative Ben Davis. We call it God and Government, where we go around and we talk to groups, often in churches, about the intersection of faith and political activism. And I didn't think anything of it. People invited me to go speak. Yeah, I'm going to go speak. Why wouldn't I? But you're right, it does kind of step on toes, and that was kind of brought to my attention, from folks who were concerned about, what are you doing in my district, talk to my people. And it kind of took me aback at first, because I'm like, I'm not, like, this is not about me trying to encroach upon your territory or whatever. Like, that's not what this is. It's somebody invited me to speak, and so I'm going to come speak. I'm thinking about them. I'm thinking about our cause. Like, hopefully this helps you, like me being there and speaking to these issues that they care about. Come on out. And what the encouraging thing is, that as that sort of dynamic has developed over the interim, that's exactly what happened. Like, once I realized, oh, I should probably be notifying whoever's district I'm going into that I'm going to be there talking to people who are probably their people. Um, I started to kind of coordinate and be like, hey, come on out. Like, let's get you involved. Let's have you as part of the Q&A. Like, let's make this a team effort. But there's a balancing act there, right? Of, I don't think it's of service to those people to say, well, I'm not going to come talk to you because that would offend your local guy. Right. At the same time, I don't want to be exclusionary towards anyone, especially if they're a colleague who serves in that area. And so it's been this interesting balance to try and discover. But it is, you're absolutely right. Like, the more willing you are to engage, the more you'll be asked to. And it's all voluntary, right? Like, nobody's paying me to do any of this stuff. And so it does become kind of a snowball of unpaid activity.
Yeah, no, you're right. And it with young kids like you have, and like I had, you forfeit going to some events or games and things like that your kids are in. And it's an absolute, it's a sacrifice to serve and to do it, full speed. And one of the things that you'll run into in the future doing the same type of events. Now, this last session, Democrats were in control of everything, right? So Republicans, and I was doing a scorecard for LEA, I found that Republicans voted in lockstep on so much legislation and amendments. It was just kind of like oppose everything. Way more so than when the Democrats had full control back in 2012, where Republicans were still voting for Democrat omnibus bills and stuff like that. This is just like everybody's voting in lockstep. In the future, if we win back the House and you have a divided government again, you will see Republicans voting for the stuff that you oppose. And that's when it becomes even more contentious when you go into their district and talk to their local people, because you will explain the truth on this legislation, hopefully, and they will see that their legislator maybe is not as conservative as you are. And that's when it can get a little contentious going into talking to people in their districts. But for now, I think most of the Republicans voted almost identically on much of the legislation last year. So yeah, it'll be good. So any particular junkets or trips that you wanted to dive into to talk about things that you learned in the interim? And this is one of the things that I've explained to people about serving in the legislature, is that you have access to do so much. If you want to, like, I can call up, I used to, call up and say, hey, I want to go tour a nuclear power plant because I hear that nuclear power is, contentious. Welcome, come on down, go tour a prison, and to learn about the issues that you're voting on is so important. So anything in particular jump out as a great learning experience that you had in the interim?
Yeah, on the Public Safety Committee, our focus has been on touring correctional facilities for the most part. I mean, there have been other committee field trips, for lack of a better term, that have taken place. But the overwhelming majority of them have just been going around to the various correctional facilities in the state and touring them. And so at this point, I've heard the spiel from DOC probably a dozen times or more about what their issues are. And they're significant, right? So one of the statistics that stands out is about a third, something like 33% of the state's deferred maintenance on assets is in the DOC. So what that means is deferred maintenance means something's broke, it needs to be fixed, but we're not going to fix it right now. That's what deferred maintenance means. 33% of that is in the DOC. So our prisons are literally falling apart, which is a little bit of a problem, right? And certainly none are being constructed to replace them. And so, that's a huge ask. One of the things that stood out to me from our latest trip, the most recent one, we toured Stillwater, which is a 100-year-old building at this point, is that in order to bring the entire correction system in the state of Minnesota just up to fair condition, not good, not excellent, but just like, this is okay, we can get by, it would cost about $750 million, which just so happens to be the initial price tag of the renovations to our state office building in St. Paul. So we're spending that money to build ourselves a Taj Mahal for politicians, complete with a observation deck for the speaker to step out upon and gaze upon the masses assembled below in the Capitol lawn. But we're not going to fix and bring up to speed, not even bring up to speed, just like bring to working, functioning condition our prison system. In fact, in the governor's projected budget that he laid out for this year for bonding, I think the number is somewhere in the 70s of $70 million or something like that. So you're talking about like about 10% of what the DOC needs just to get to like functionality in the system is what they're going to get. And that amount of money, which they're, any agency is never going to complain about getting money. But in this case, and one of the questions we asked them on the tour was, how do you decide how to spend that money when it's such a minuscule amount of what you need just to make the place function? And they kind of acknowledge, they're like, it's going to be the most urgent things. It's a difficult process to decide what to do and what to lay by the wayside, but we got to work with what you're giving us. And so there it is. And I'd be interested to hear from my Democrat colleagues regarding their thoughts on all of that, on what our priorities are as a state. I can speculate as to why it is the way that it is. That speculation is not going to be favorable to my Democrat colleagues. I mean, when you take into consideration their public statements and their obvious legislative focus, the things that they've been putting to the top of the list, clearly their interest is in, look, the DOC has as one of its strategic goals, quote unquote, zero warehousing, which means nobody in prison. So it's hard to look at 33% of the state's deferred maintenance being in the DOC and not think that that's on purpose, especially when we just had a $19 billion surplus. We raised $10 billion in taxes. We raised the state budget by 40%. We created a new state department for children, youth, and families. We're creating all kinds of new state offices for this person of color, and offices for that identity, and offices for this, and offices for that. So we have no trouble spending money and tossing money around for all sorts of political causes and constituency groups. But dealing with like a core function of government, public safety, that we just can't seem to find the money for. And it's hard to look at that and not assign motive, that it's intentional, that this is what they want. They want our prisons to fall apart.
Well, I would say that the Democrats are spending a lot of money revamping our prison system and rebuilding it, but it's actually in the homes and houses of all the convicted felons who are just going to be sitting at home and not serving time, because that's how the Democrats see the new prisons. So I would agree that that's probably intentional, that they're going to, why build in polished new, old prisons when the Democrats don't want to send anybody to prison. And we had a large prison in the western side of our state in Appleton that, but it's private, and so the Democrats wanted to ensure that never reopened and would not authorize that, and they did that. They did so legislatively to prevent private prisons from opening in Minnesota, because the government knows how to waste money better than private companies, and so yeah, there's probably a lot of deferred maintenance. And so what I hear is that you're advocating for a bonding bill. Is that right?
Well, listen, bonding has a legitimate purpose and a legitimate role in this process. Certainly, I would not have a problem with bonding that addressed core functions of government, and corrections is certainly one of those core functions.
Yeah. And I met with Gwen Walls when I was in office, and she's a huge advocate for free college for prisoners. Was one of her things that she was working on. And so when they say they need $700 million, I would be curious to drill down and look at the line items of what they want to build, because you might find colleges and universities within prisons being part of that, and some other stuff that's unnecessary. But yeah, should we stop the roofs from leaking? Yes. Should we address some of the conditions in prisons, or make sure that the locks are functioning? Yes. So I would push back to make sure that we're only fixing what needs to be fixed. A lot of stuff, of course, in that I think it's called HEAPR, or that there's a lot of money that's spent on colleges and universities that's called deferred maintenance, where they actually want to redo and build new buildings, and it's not just fixing what's broken. But yeah, so outside of the prison tour, did you take any other trips to go learn about new policies, or did you go out of state for anything?
I have not been out of state. That again, with my day job, it was very difficult to get away for anything. In terms of like official trips, I'm trying to scour my mind to think of, we toured the public safety training center. I want to say, I don't want to get it wrong, I want to say it was at Hennepin Tech. I think that's correct, in kind of in the Osseo Maple Grove area. And that was impressive. I mean, that facility is a heck of a place. And of course, you go to these places and it's all a pitch for more money, right?
Yeah.
And in their case, their guy who's in charge of their practical training. So they have a training facility that's kind of set up to look like a city block, but it's inside part of their building, and they use it for all sorts of training scenarios, training for law enforcement. But they also bring in agencies from around the area will come to Hennepin Tech and use their training facility to like do fire stuff and what have you. And so this guy has this vision, this dream that he casts of wanting to build out like an outdoor, he calls it a village, like a space where it's like multiple blocks with different mock-ups of buildings and what have you, where they could do simulations of a multi-agency, multi-alarm responses to like a multiple story fire or something along those lines, or a hostage situation, or whatever the case may be. And it's this grand dream of being able to provide practical education. And I don't remember exactly what the price tag was, but obviously it's going to be in the tens of millions of dollars to do something like that. And again, I look at something like that and I think to myself, core function of government. Do I want our first responders to have better practical training? This is something that could be of service, not just to the local area, but if you had something like that, people would come from, they'd probably drive down from Duluth or somewhere, or maybe even Wisconsin, out of state, to come and be a part of that. Could that be worthwhile? Maybe. But is that going to be in the bonding bill this year? Probably not, would be my guess, because
not unless it's a DEI training facility or something, in the opposite purpose, and then they'll slide that in there at the last minute and say, Representative Hudson, why do you oppose funding for our police training? So that's how politics works. So what we hear is that this is when the legislators are heavily lobbied in between session. An example that I'll give you is Minnesota Zoo lobbies for money every year, and their representative, Democrat or Republican, will always advocate for all this money to come to the Minnesota Zoo. And so they kept on inviting me to go take a tour. And I've got young kids. They would love to get a back behind the scenes tour of the Minnesota Zoo. How cool is that? We went down there and got to go feed the fish, the sharks and stuff in the aquarium, and get to go up top, get to go through the kitchen where they, cook, use better vegetables than what I have in my kitchen to feed all these animals. And at the end, they pitch you heavily they wanted, I think, $13 million for a walking trail. They wanted to take the monorail, right, which is nobody rides it anymore. There's a walking path on the ground, and they wanted to convert the monorail to an elevated, basically a mile-long deck, And I'm like, this is stupid. Why would we spend $13 million doing that? And of course, they got the money from the legislature to do that.
I was going to say it opened this last fall and it's up. I haven't been back there, but I'm sure the legislative day at the zoo will be at some point during session again this year, and we'll go walk the path that we could be walking below above, because hey, it's been built.
Yep. Yeah. So that's, so the legislators are heavily lobbied. And of course, there's bonding tours that kick off where they go around the state and listen to people's community's needs and listen to the pitches and put together legislation. So on a personal side, anything big in your family, kids, big events or anything?
I would say, I kind of addressed the personal stuff with just the occupational thing, right? There are issues with my kids or accomplishments with my kids. My eldest, it's kind of interesting because last year I got lobbied / solicited quite a bit by a private group that offers robotics competitions for middle and high school age kids. And I took my sons to River Center to see kind of their state competition last year. And I wanted to introduce them to the idea of this is something you could do. I know both my kids are kind of technically inclined, especially my eldest. And lo and behold, kind of independently, he found his way into STMA robotics this year, and has met with a significant amount of success in his group. And he does coding. He's doing things that I don't even understand. Like, we've crossed that threshold of the kid knows stuff that dad doesn't know. And so that was really encouraging. My youngest, he's had some health issues that has prevented him from being involved in activities, which is really unfortunate. But he is a kid from the 80s, in the sense that he comes home from school, turns around and goes right back outside and is gone for hours. And, he's rip roaring up and down the block with other kids on the street. And I love that. I love the fact that he's an outdoorsy kid and a social kid. He's kind of the opposite of his brother in that way. His brother just kind of sits in his room and composes music and codes programs and whatever it is that he's doing, to being creative. It's productive stuff, but he's very much a homebody. So that's kind of been the winter, and then our summers are taken up usually with cabin trips and what have you. So, we're keeping the work-life service balance as best we can in the Hudson household.
Good. That's good to hear. All right. Well, let's jump into talking about some legislation and legislative priorities. One of the biggest bills that's going to pass this session, that I hope doesn't pass, but probably will, is the Democrats' Medical Assistance in Dying, or MAID bill, which is House File 1930. I don't see it introduced in the Senate yet. And what this bill is what it sounds like. It's government assisting doctors to exterminate sick people, people that are at or near the end of their expected life. And on a high level, I haven't read this bill, this latest version, but I believe it's if you receive a diagnosis that you will die within 6 months or 3 months, then the doctor can assist you in checking out. in killing you through medication or injecting you with something that will kill you. This is, I mean, for people who value individual liberty, they'll say, well, you should be able to check out on your own terms. This is about you and you alone. But we all know what happens in the background where insurance companies, put your insurance company executive hat on and you think, well, there's a lot of bills that come at the end of someone's life. And so if we could just cut costs, we could offer people, actually, you could offer people two insurance policies. One policy is that we're going to continue to fund your medical bills to the end of your natural life. And then the other one is if you get these conditions, these diagnoses, that you agree to either take the blue pill or we're not going to pay for your treatment. But the monthly premiums for that insurance plan might be half of what they would be for the full service plan. Now you're creating an environment where there's two different healthcare systems, one for the poor and one for the wealthy. In Canada, they implemented MAID, and as of 2021, so 2 years ago, and this has been ramping up, 4.8% or just under 5% of all deaths, car accidents, everything else, almost 5% of all deaths in British Columbia and in Quebec are the government killing you. Okay, because all the doctors in Canada work for the government. 5%. In other provinces, it's somewhere between 2 and 5%. But think of that. And this is just a system that was put in place a few years ago, and it's ramping up radically. They just found in Canada a panel, a parliamentary committee recommends euthanasia for minors, for children, without parental consent. They're actually, the government is killing off people with mental health issues, not diseases, not cancer diagnosis, but mental health issues of depression. The government is assisting in killing people. That's where this has gone in just a few years in Canada. It's going to go that way in Minnesota if this bill passes. Walter, what are your thoughts on this?
Listen, the top priority for Democrats is death dealing, and that's beyond dispute. Their number one top priority, their House File 1 and Senate File 1 in 2023, was killing children up until the very moment they draw a breath. Their top priority, or certainly one of their top priorities going into 2024, is killing you on the other end of life, killing you at the end. To me, it's incredibly on brand that death is the priority of the Democrat Party, because fundamentally their ideology, which at root, let's not pussyfoot around, at root, their ideology is Marxism, is a fundamentally anti-human ideology. Their policies discount, in many cases, fully discount the humanity of individual human beings. That's certainly what abortion does. Their arguments for abortion don't even acknowledge that unborn children exist as such. And the longer they talk about that issue, the more vehemently and viciously they deny the humanity of the people whose lives they're ending in that debate. Fast forward to the end of life, and they can't quite take it that far because the person is sitting there, lying there in a hospital bed and is surrounded by family and obviously has some inherent value. But they are still doing the same thing. They're still discounting the inherent value of human life by suggesting that what makes human life valuable and livable and worthy of upholding and maintaining is comfort. If you and also utility. That's a little bit more implicit, a little bit more unspoken, which is the case that you made of, well, why are we quote unquote wasting all of this money to keep somebody alive who we believe is terminally ill and is going to pass within a certain amount of time? Isn't that a waste? What are they contributing That's kind of the other implicit premise here. They're not really contributing anything to society in those final months, weeks, days. So, what's the point of wasting all of these resources on this person who's of no service to us? It's really profoundly disgusting and sick from a moral perspective, but again, entirely on brand with where the Democratic Party is at. And this idea applies to every other area of public policy. I think back to the blackout bill, to their priorities on energy, the idea that we're going to ban energy production from sources that make up 80% of the current power grid. The objective there is not human thriving and flourishing. Next year in 2025, Xcel Energy is going to start deploying smart thermostats that have the capacity to circumvent your desire for what the temperature should be set in your house and default to whatever your masters who actually own you think the temperature should be in your house. We've seen this in other states, just like we've seen with assisted suicide, how it's implemented in Canada. We've seen with these smart thermostats, how they've been implemented in Colorado. You had a lot of Coloradans who were denied air conditioning during a heat wave recently. So when you've had this curve of civilization where quality of life has increased with the development of technology and with our abundance and our prosperity and our productivity has increased. And now what you're seeing this peak, and we're starting to intentionally not as a result of like the market or natural forces, but as a result of intentional public policy, we're starting to go in the other direction of, you used to be able to just set your air conditioning and be cool in your home during a heat wave. Now, though, you're going to go back to not having the availability of that quality of life, not for your sake, not because you're important and we value your life, but because of the imagined utility that it provides to the planet, which is apparently something we should concern ourselves with apart from how it affects actual human lives. And so this assisted suicide thing is just another card in the deck of anti-human, anti-life, and immoral Marxist policy that is the root of where the Democrats are at.
Yeah. To dive into the details of this bill, I know at the onset of this discussion, I was talking about what's happening in Canada and where I see this going. The Democrats, I mean, I gave them credit last session for how they implemented their legislation, their strategy. It's brilliant, because the core piece of their legislation, whether it's House File 1 that did abortion, unrestricted abortion, or this one, they address everybody's concerns from the onset in the core of the legislation. This bill specifically says it does not apply to minors. It says that you can't sell insurance policies based on someone's decision to kill themselves or not. You can't reward them for financially for making that decision. That's in the initial bill. So you can say, well, it doesn't do any of that. This is just the framework for what they want to do, right? And it's supposedly restricted, but you know that once they get their foot in the door with this bill, that there could be other legislation, and it might even be in the same legislative session. That's what's so brilliant about it. They could introduce a second bill that actually allows MAID to be applied to minors with mental health issues. But when this bill hits the floor, you as a legislator can't discuss the other bill, because that is not the legislation before the body. That is, you have to remain on topic of discussing and amending what is in this bill. And so they do this strategically and specifically, and the way that it's reported through the media is only addressing what happens here, and then the real nuts and bolts of this that would enable it to be used for minors, that would enable insurance companies who obviously are going to be lobbying heavily for this, to discount their insurance for people that choose the blue pill. That will come in smaller legislation that will be amended to some omnibus bill in slide through at the end of session, when they'll distract you from something else going on, like, the presidential election. So it's all on purpose. But but the nuts and bolts of this bill actually do prohibit a lot of the things that I had talked about, being the concerns. One of the other things in here that's of concern is on the death certificate, it can't say suicide. It has to say what the other underlying health issue is, whatever the other terminal disease might be. You can't say that they committed suicide. In other words, we're not going to be able to track how many people check out at the end of the government's barrel, because you're just not going to see it. And so the concerns that a lot of people have, well, God, is it going to be 3, 4, 5% of the people dying in Minnesota are going to be killed by government? We don't know. We won't know. And that's specifically in this legislation to not track this. And that should be a concern for a lot of people too.
And again, that's on brand and in rhythm for the Democrats. They did the same thing with the abortion bill, and the abortion bills that they passed last year, where one of the effects was we're not going to keep records anymore. We're not going to keep records of how many are happening or why or what the circumstances were, because we don't want you to know. We don't want to know at the legislature, and we don't want you to know as the people. And to me, that's just such a tell, right? Like if your underlying moral argument is correct, whether you're talking about abortion and the underlying moral argument that a mother should be able to solicit help in killing her own child if she doesn't want that child, if that is indeed a moral argument that is righteous and honorable and virtuous, why wouldn't you want to have a counter going of all of the righteous, moral, virtuous acts that are taking place in the state of Minnesota? Similarly with this, if it is in fact morally righteous and virtuous to be killing people because they're experiencing pain or suffering, or they're facing a large financial expense in order to receive hospice care for the next 3 months, 6 months, if that's the moral and correct thing to do, what are you ashamed of? Why aren't we putting that right on the death certificate? It should be a point of pride, right? If you're saying that I'd made a decision that spared my family untold expense, I made a decision that spared me unnecessary suffering, and this was the right decision. It was a good decision. Why shouldn't that be proudly displayed with honor on your death certificate? And we know the answer. The answer is because they know in their hearts, because their conscience is written by the hand of God on their heart, that this is evil and immoral and wrong and unrighteous and from the pit of hell. And they don't want any record kept of it because they don't want that shown. It's the verse that's outside my office at the state office building, John 3:19. They hated the light and they loved the darkness because their works were evil. That's what this is.
Wow. I wanted to just offer my personal experience with discussing medical assistance in dying. And Republicans have to come up with a better term than this government sponsored suicide or whatever. As many of you know, my family that I grew up in is a big liberal family. I'm the only conservative that came out of it. And my dad and I would go to nursing homes to see, his relatives or friends. And he would turn to me and say, "Don't ever let me get like that." Like, somebody coming up with an ostomy bag, or, just in a wheelchair and miserable or going through, dementia. He would turn to me and say, "If I ever get like that, just bring me my gun and come back with a mop." And, that was his way. It was his response. He didn't want to do that. But when I was running for office, actually, he was diagnosed with, and actually it was before I was running for office, he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. About 10 or 11 years ago. And pancreatic cancer is like the silent killer. It is usually people that are diagnosed only have a few weeks left. And he caught it early, but he was convinced by some that he should avoid treatment and just ride it out. And so he was immediately you go through this when you get a diagnosis like that, your mind just starts turning, and all the misery that you're going to have through, chemo, or it's do you fight or do you not? And a lot of people go through that and they just say, "You know what, I can't deal with this," or they go through chemo in their first few months are miserable and they say, I don't want to live like this. And they go through a mental game. And if medical assistance, if suicide by a doctor is brought up at the hospital, they may jump at that. They may just make the decision and check out. And so a lot of people go through that frustration. And my dad, if this was law in Minnesota, he would have checked out because he was struggling with this battle at the beginning. But in the end, he fought for 4 years, which was unprecedented for pancreatic cancer. And in the end, he had an ostomy bag, which he had said he would never do because he started a nonprofit group for, a school of rock for kids in Brainerd to do summer camp where they could do rock bands, all the stuff that he loved in life. The last 4 years of his life were the best. And he got to share them with his grandkids. And I mean, he fought. And when the doctor said the cancer has come back with a vengeance and it's blocked all your intestines and you can't, he's like, well, can I put another bag back here? Like he was trying to, they said, well, maybe you could get another month. And he said, I'll do it. Like he was fighting for survival at the very end. And if that Mark had seen the Mark from 4 years before, ready to just check out, it would have been an interesting debate to listen to them, to have that discussion. But so many people go through that. That's why having this option to check out early, so many people will take it, and they will miss out on could be the best years of their life. And of course, you have misdiagnoses, you have breakthroughs, you have people that beat the odds. Well, 90% people in your condition are going to die within 6 months. Well, now you qualify for this program to check out, and you could save your, all the lobbying comes in to say how much you're going to save your family financially and all this stuff. Well, this is why this is such a bad bill. We're messing with people's minds, and it's going to create just expand the society that doesn't value life. They've talked about life at birth, with abortion, and now they're talking about just checking out at the end of life. And if teenagers are struggling with depression, it goes on and on. And one time, one more story, when I was living in Los Angeles, I went into work I was working at Hughes Aeronautics. I went in and I found a guy who had jumped off a 13-story parking garage. And I was the first person to find the body and everything. So I had to state to the police, and it was part of the trial. And the guy found out he had diabetes and jumped off the 13th floor of a parking garage because he didn't want to deal with that. Strange things happen with suicide. But if it's normalized through your doctor, who everyone trusts, talking to you about this option, it is going to just suck in so many more people that shouldn't be checking out.
Yeah, I mean, that's really what's at the root of this is, who are we as a people? What is the content of our soul? What are we ordaining as a populace? What are we giving birth to spiritually? And when it's one thing to acknowledge the fact that, like, your dad's attitude at a certain point in his life, which is, I don't want to have to face that kind of suffering. I would rather just you give me my gun and come back with a mop. That It's one thing for someone to have that attitude and even to act upon it individually. I would regard that as tragic, but it's not sanctioned under the law, right? Like, it's not something that we're condoning as a society. In this case, once you start talking about assisted suicide, you're talking about coming alongside somebody and playing an active role, a causal effect in their death, which is a totally different thing. Like, actual suicide, where you take an action as an individual to terminate your own life, is tragic and I believe immoral. But assisted suicide, that's murder. Okay? Like, when you come alongside somebody and help them kill themselves, you're a murderer. And the other distinction that I would draw here is, there's a very clear difference in my mind between making the decision to not accept treatment, right? So when your dad got his diagnosis, he was contemplating not taking chemo, not doing these things. That is not suicide, because you're not actively causing your death. The cause of death is still the underlying element. There's a huge difference between that and taking a pill, a poison pill, that's going to cause your death. And so I think there's going to be a lot of, as we move forward with this debate, there's going to be a lot of conflation of those two things, and a lot of efforts to try to create this sort of moral gray area where we say, well, maybe under these circumstances it would be appropriate, and what have you. But you're absolutely right. This is a wedge in the door of the state playing an active role, and our institutions, our healthcare institutions, which are quasi state entities. I mean, the degree to which healthcare is regulated in this country, and particularly in this state, it might as well be a state department. Um, you're talking about the state playing an active role in the execution of people, which is deeply ironic because I know you and many others, the vast majority of people, are opposed to capital punishment. Weird how that works. Like, we're not going to take action to apply justice and administer justice to vicious, vile criminals who've committed heinous acts against others, but we're going to help grandma kill herself. We're going to kill grandma because she's going to cost us too much money. I mean, the moral inversion of our society at this point is something that is really odious as its odor reaches the nostrils of God.
Well, let's talk about the response to this bill. First of all, I mean, this is the priority of Democrats, and we'll have a debate on the state flag and a different show. But I'm just appalled at the Republican Party spending donor money to create a website trying to change oppose the change of the flag when they should be spending every available resource into fighting the actual legislation, like government assisted, suicide and things that are actually going to impact people's lives. Um, there hasn't been a campaign from the Republican side opposing this. One of the things that I think is interesting that the Democrats' strategy in getting this through is they actually hired a Republican lobbying firm to out of state groups that are. This isn't a DFL thing. This is out of state, national interest in promoting government assisted suicide. They hired a Republican lobbying firm to actually usher this through the legislature, which is just dumbfounding because Republicans aren't in control, but they want to address what the Republicans are going to do for their messaging in order to help get this through. But Republicans need to come out with a campaign. They need to find people that have beat cancer and have beat the odds to go out on a campaign and talk about how just because you get a diagnosis saying you're going to die in 6 months doesn't mean you're going to. Medical practice is called practice for a reason because they're still learning, because they make mistakes, and don't discount the odds that you're given. We need to get out there and go after the Democrats. We can't just talk about financials. We can't talk about how Democrats need this in order to usher in government-run healthcare, because in Canada, if without this program, without killing off 5% of their populace, their program would go broke. But they need this in order to have government run healthcare. We can't go after that. We have to actually go after Democrats' desires to pass this, which is going after, the hearts, pulling on their heartstrings. We need to show them all the people that have beat the odds and would have checked out if this was law. And that will help stop this legislation from going through, but there isn't a campaign from Republicans to address that.
Yeah, I mean, I will preface my response by confessing that I am intentionally holding back on expressing how frustrated I am with what you're talking about. And the reason why I'm intentionally going to hold back on expressing how frustrated I am is because these people are my friends, these people are my allies, and there are ongoing conversations about what messaging should look like and how intense it should be and how frequent it should be and where it should be coming from and what have you. And I want to convince people, and it's hard to do that when you're going out in public and calling them out. Yep. But with that said, with that disclaimer, this is the top frustration I have as a legislator, as an activist at heart, as a conservative, as a Christian, as a father, as a member of a family and a community, a Minnesotan, an American. How is this difficult? This should be the easiest thing in the world. This should be the easiest thing in the world to point to unmitigated evil and call it evil and shame the people who are advocating for it. That's the answer. We have to bring shame to people who are advocating for murder. That shouldn't be difficult. That's a very low rhetorical bar. Yep. It really is. And I don't understand either the hesitancy or the lack of underlying material support to make that happen. And I'm sure, like, I try to proceed with some degree of humility and tell myself there are things that I don't know, right? Like, there are considerations that I might not be privy to as a first term rank and file member of the Minnesota House in the Republican caucus in a safe district. Like, there are broader considerations than the sensibilities of Walter Hudson. Like, I try to keep that in mind and afford people grace. But it's extremely difficult for me to do so because this should be a very easy, not just an easy task, but it should be eagerly pursued. Like, people should be chomping at the bit. Like, our actual struggle should not be whether we're communicating and to what extent. Our actual struggle should be, did we take that too far? Like, we should be asking ourselves, are we spending too much money and time going after these ghouls? Was that too intense? Like, that's where the tension should be. And instead, the tension is at, should we even get out of bed today? And I just don't understand it. It's really maddening.
Well, like I said, and I've said many times before, Republicans suck at messaging. That is our weakness. We don't know how to properly engage or put a phrase to what we're trying to do. And it can't be about just opposing everything the Democrats do. And you guys get involved in that. And you see that firsthand in the legislature where some bills are actually not that bad, but just because the Democrats are doing it this time around, it's got to be the worst thing in the world. And so everything is just evil, evil, evil for what they're doing. But there are certain things like this that absolutely are evil. And you need to address it like in a marketing campaign. What are we going to call medical assistance in dying? What is the phrase that we're going to use which flips the whole narrative on its head? What are we going to do to engage people? You have to come out with a program that actually gets people off the couch and gets them concerned about it. And then you also have to say, you know what? If you polled Minnesotans right now, would you, in using Democrat terminology as far as medical assistance in dying, do we want to prevent violent suicides? Do we want to help people, that are suffering and in pain? Most people in Minnesota probably say, yeah, it should be an option, right? It's medication. It isn't like you're, injecting people in the eye with acid. It's something that's, tolerable pain-wise or whatever. Like, I get it. But if you talk about what the end result is going to be, with, insurance companies saving all these, billions of dollars and state-run healthcare being able to be ushered in, and hear the stories of 100 individuals who have beat the odds and are speaking out against this, and that how in the worst time in their life, when they receive the worst news possible about a cancer diagnosis, in walks the doctor talking about how they can stop their pain and suffering and save their family from financial problems. Because if you get a diagnosis saying you're going to die and you could die in 6 months, your first reaction is, what am I going to do to those who I'm leaving behind? How do I provide for my family and set up, because I don't have life insurance or whatever. And then it's like, well, do you really want to burden them with $380,000 in debt, medical debt? Oh gosh, no. Like that's the point where people make this decision. So we need to go after that, to go after the heartstrings, to change the minds of the masses to be opposed to government assisted suicide. I mean, this is what we have to do. But there's no marketing campaign. There's no ads out there for it or against this bill. And this bill, strangely enough, I've talked to some senators, this bill actually passed committee, was approved by committee before session even started, which is strange. They know that there is going to be objections like the ones that I spoke of, and that the media will report on it. So let's get that out of the way. Committees have informational hearings all the time where they bring in testifiers to debate it in private, basically out of the limelight. And then when session starts, they'll just gavel in, talk about the bill. Well, we already debated this. We heard all the testimony, so we're going to just vote. And so they're already doing that. But we got to get ahead of it. And we talked about at the beginning of this podcast, the timelines. March 22nd. So the legislature sets deadlines. March 22nd is the first and second deadline in the same day, which means that the bill has to pass committees. In any bill that's going to become law this year, has a chance of it, has to pass committees, or has to be acted on by a committee in a favorable way, has to be voted by a committee. Each bill may have multiple stops. This bill will go to the Healthcare Policy Committee. It'll go to the Healthcare Finance Committee. It'll probably go to the Commerce Committee because it impacts insurance companies and life insurance policies. Can you collect life insurance when you check out? Most life insurance policies say if you commit suicide, you don't get money. But this bill specifically says it can't, life insurance companies can't deny you for checking out. That's why it's not on the death certificate. All these things come into play. So this bill will have to pass one committee in both House and Senate by March 22nd in order to remain on path to becoming law. And then it has to pass all the committee stops in both chambers by April 19th in order to become law. Those deadlines apply to any legislation that you're trying to get through this year. So understand that March 22nd is going to be coming very soon, right? It's like in a month and a half. So this is going to be acted on very quickly. And of course, the rules can be broken by Democrats because they're in charge, so they could slip legislation in at the last second in a omnibus bill at the very end. But these are the rules that they can use to stop legislation if Republicans want to get involved in trying to advocate for other bills.
Yep, absolutely. I mean, the process, that was kind of my major frontline takeaway from year one, is that the entire process is a complete illusion, that we have a mythology of democracy that does not actually exist in the real world. I mean, all of this stuff is plotted out. It's theater, the testimony and hearings and floor debates and all of that. I mean, there's parts of it, there's constituent parts of it that are authentic. Like when we get up and give a speech on the floor, like that's not scripted, the individual member giving a speech, at least on our side. But the plan, like the outcome, like what's going to happen at the end of the day, that is all known in advance and orchestrated in advance. I mean, that's the function of things like a whip and a leader and what have you. And so, this idea that, and I want to be careful about how I make this point because I don't want to demoralize people where they think, well, there's no point in getting involved. There's very much a point in getting involved. We can make change. We can derail their plans, and we have in a number of cases. But it's important to realize why that works when it does, and compare and contrast that to things that don't work. Things that don't work are just going online and tweeting about it. Just liking a comment, just having a complaint session with your friends over beers at the bar. Like those things are not going to result in political change. You need to muster strategically political pushback that's actually going to be effectual, and usually that involves targeting of vulnerable members, of which there are quite a few, and this is an election year. The dynamic's a little bit different. My colleague on the Public Safety Committee, Cedric Frazier, recently said in the media something akin to, this is an election year, so things get a little funky or a little wonky, which I retweeted that and said, yep, this is the translation is, we can only get away with defying the will of the people so much this year.
Yes.
And that is the reality of it, right? Is that it's the tension amongst the majority, and I think this probably applies to Republicans as well, but it certainly seems to apply more to Democrats because they have a more cohesive political will, ideologically. The tension that they have to deal with is always what they want to do versus what they can get away with. And they have been riding that red line this whole session.
Let's chat just about the campaigns for a few moments. This is an election year. For every member of the Minnesota House of Representatives is up for re-election. It is not an election year for Minnesota state senators. Their term is 4 years, so this is their bye year. They don't have to run for re-election this year, but the Senate has a 1-seat majority on the Democrat side, and the House has a 4-seat majority on the. Is it a 4-seat?
Yeah,
on the Democrat side. So there's a chance that House Republicans can retake the majority. If they can do that, they can stop the legislation from getting ushered through for full Democrat control. However, Kelly Morrison, who is a state senator, is running for Dean Phillips' congressional seat in CD3. That means that if she wins, and she's expected to, she will have to resign as a state senator, which will cause a special election to occur on the Democrat side to backfill her seat. And so the majority in the state Senate will be on the ballot. Likely it will be a special election, or will it be part of the general election? I can't remember if she's going to, she has a time period where if she resigns more than 72 days before the election, then it goes to be on the regular ballot, which would benefit Democrats. Republicans have a slight advantage when it comes to special elections. In her district is a swing district. So I would venture to say that all of the money spent on Minnesota House seats combined will be about the same as her 1 seat for state Senate. And it is that important. And if she goes to a special election, I would say that the chances of us gaining that 1 seat in the Senate is probably 50% or greater. I mean, I think we have a slight advantage. I don't know about regaining the Minnesota House. It's depressing to think about, but I think Democrats are brilliant at messaging. And I mean, in my mind, I'm thinking if Republicans are successful in blocking the medical assistance in dying bill, how could that be bad? How could Democrats come out and campaign against Republicans and say, he didn't want to kill grandma, right? But it's not going to be about that, because I didn't think that they could win on the abortion issue either. And it's just like, they're going to come out and say Walter Hudson is against medical choice, right? Yeah. This guy who championed during COVID medical choice and medical freedom is against medical freedom. It'll be flipped, and they'll come at you with terminology that you just can't believe they can put on a postcard, because that's what they do. They're great at messaging.
Well, and that's why, and listen, I don't claim to be the smartest man in communications. Certainly nobody's paying me for it, right? So I'm probably not. But I can only go with my instincts. And my instincts tell me that you combat that by calling them murderers. Right? Like, put them on the defensive, because that's what they're trying to do. Like the strategy that you just outlined of saying that I'm against choice, the objective of that rhetoric is to put me on the defensive and get me to say, no, I'm not, because then I'm on my side of the 50-yard line defending, right? No, you toss the ball over into their territory and you say, you're a murderer. Tell me you're not. Tell me how passing a bill that literally kills people is not murder. And then make them talk.
Here's a good angle. Somewhere in Minnesota statute, and I have them behind me, I should dig it out and find the right one. But somewhere in Minnesota, someone has been prosecuted and convicted for convincing someone to commit suicide, right? Whether it's
right, yes,
right, but bullying at school, somebody is down and depressed, and someone's like, "You should commit suicide. You should do it," and they do it, and that person can be found guilty for assisting in that. We need to find that statute and open it up to apply to doctors, right? Who assist in convincing people to kill themselves, or to other groups who print the literature in the doctor's office about taking the blue pill. And by the way, my terminology and calling it the blue pill was on purpose, because I think this is a totally Democrat thing that you're swallowing. But I think that we need to go after that statute to open it up, to have that discussion. The same thing when we're talking about abortion, right? If you can be convicted of murder for vehicular homicide when the woman loses her child, or if you batter someone and if you beat up a woman who's pregnant and she loses that child, you can be prosecuted for killing that child. That same statute should be applied to, in some way for abortion, but we don't have that discussion. We don't talk about that conflict legislatively, but we should.
No, I mean, I brought it up in when public safety heard Tina Liebling's absurd abortion bill that ended up passing last year. And it was a moment of providence. It certainly wasn't any genius on my part, but I tripped upon a number of statutes, because what Tina Liebling's bill did, I believe, was House File 72 or something like that, or 42. It repealed all of the previously existing protections that we had on the unborn. Almost. It turns out that in the criminal law, there is still today a effective section that enumerates a number of crimes, and I believe the heading of the chapter or section of law actually says crimes against the unborn, and it's things like assault, murder, person crimes. And I pointed this out to Tina Liebling. I'm like, you missed a few, right? Like, if your goal here is to wipe out any civil rights for people before they draw their first breath of free air, there's a few statutes here that you failed to include in your bill, because we still have the ability here to charge somebody with assaulting an unborn child or murdering an unborn child.
Wait, not a cluster of cells? Not a cluster of cells? It's actually, it says child?
I believe it does say, or it either says child or offspring or something along those lines. But even the word fetus, so like in their effort, as we talked about earlier, to dehumanize the unborn, they'll refer to this word fetus because phonetically it sounds like something subhuman or unhuman. But when you look at the etymology of the word fetus, it means offspring. So it's just another way of saying child. That's all it is. And so, the point being that, yes, we have in law this precedent that you evoke, that it is illegal to kill an unborn child. And basically what they've created is a broad exception that says, unless the mother doesn't value that human life, unless the mother decides to strip her own child of its civil rights, in that case, kill away. That's what they said last year. And in a similar sense, going forward with this and assisted suicide, you're absolutely right. In one context, it's murder, it's manslaughter, it's abusive. But as long as the guy who's engaged in the exact same behavior is wearing a white lab coat, well, suddenly it's A-okay. He's holding a clipboard. He's got one of those little mirrored doodads on his head. Yeah, that makes it A-okay.
Well, and that's what this national group that's promoting this bill was part of the Jack Kevorkian defense group, right? The people that were defending Jack Kevorkian back in the early 90s or late 80s or whenever that was. So it's been a long run for them, and they're continuing to try to promote this in multiple states, and Minnesota is their target now. So I hope that Republicans can get their stuff together and come out with a campaign to stop this legislation. I think this is one of the worst things that can happen. And I should have said this at the onset, but this is the second year of the biennium in Minnesota, the legislative biennium. So bills from last year that didn't pass are still active and can be brought forward without being reintroduced. This is traditionally called the policy year. Last year, the odd year is the financial year where they put together the budget for the state. It doesn't mean the spending stops, because this year, programs that were funded last year that never took off or decided they've changed things or they want to jigger numbers around, they will do a supplemental spending bill where they take money from this pot and put it in here. Of course, we have a surplus that continues to grow, and they'll probably spend another $1 billion or $2 billion or $3 billion this year on more stuff, much of it unnecessary. But expect a supplemental spending bill. When I came in the legislature in a special election, I came in during the policy year, and my Republican senator put together $1 billion supplemental spending bill where she combined everything from all types of policy, education, transportation, healthcare, crammed it into one enormous garbage pile, 1,000 pages long. And, that was the supplemental spending bill for that year, up or down. And it was all under Republican control. So expect something even worse under Democrat control. And, but a lot of policy stuff, a lot of things that will get crammed through this year and have large impacts for Minnesota voters.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, if you thought last year was a mockery of democracy, and it was, where they were shoving things through without hitting their jurisdictional committee stops, and they were not upholding their own rules in terms of passing things off the House floor and what have you. If you thought that was a wild ride, you just buckle up and get ready for what's coming in 2024, because just as a function of reality, they have fewer days to work with. They have a crap ton that they want to get done. And they, like, the first week is your indication of what the session is going to be like. We're going to have floor sessions every single day in the first week. That's not typically how a session starts. It usually starts off pretty slow and kind of ramps its way up. They are starting, like, the 100-yard sprint gun is about to be shot next Monday, and we're going to hit the ground running as a legislature. And you better believe they're going to be gobbling up every little bit of your hard-earned taxpayer money that they can. They're out of surplus. They done spent it all in 1 year. And so now it's going to be coming after your pocketbook, pulling the stuff out that they didn't get the first time.
Yeah. The other thing I wanted to mention is the Democrats have passed such drastic legislation last year that there are some Democrats that think they may lose the majority in the House. And so the idea is, instead of trying to be conservative on what they pass in order to maintain the majority, there's also a theory of they just release everything. They have full control. They can put in place policies that can never be rolled back, especially when it comes to spending and programs and free childcare, free food for everybody. You can't take those things away. Get them done now so that it will leave Republicans with an enormous deficit. And Republicans aren't very good at cutting spending. They actually are pretty horrible at it. And so they'll try to force Republicans into raising taxes on Minnesotans so that they will be assured of losing the majority the next time around. But the Democrats are basically going to be desperate and passing everything now while they still can.
100%. And I hate to highlight that because, again, I don't want to demoralize people. I don't want people to feel as though there's no point in getting involved in the process. But you are absolutely correct. If I was a Democrat and I was developing the policy for the next 10 years for the DFL in this state, my policy position would be exactly what you just outlined. We are going to pass as much crazy transformative stuff as we possibly can while we have the trifecta, knowing that we may likely lose the House in 2024. But who cares? Because we'll still have the Senate. We'll still have Governor Walz. Even in the unlikely scenario that you outlined earlier of potentially through a special election losing the Senate, oh well, we'll still have Governor Walz. And the situation that we're putting Republicans in is so disadvantageous towards them because they are going to be dealing with the fiscal consequences of everything that we're doing now. And we think that the people are so stupid that we'll just be able to point to the fact that Republicans are in charge and all these terrible things are happening as a consequence of the bills we passed, that we'll be able to blame it on the Republicans and then take back the majorities, recertify our trifecta, have a permanent blue state of Minnesota, and move forward with the great new People's Republic of the North Star.
Yes. The Democrats, to put another analogy on it, the Democrats they have the hand grenade, they're pulling the pin, and they're going to place it in the hands of the Republican majority if the Republicans take control of the House. And
you got it.
They'll absolve themselves of all the damage they've done to our state. And there's nothing nothing Democrats love more than watching Republicans try to cut spending for any program, because they'll pull out people that are impacted by that and make it into the biggest issue that Republicans hate, this person or this group of people. And so they have a plan, win or lose, they have a plan on winning for the next time around. So we will try to stay on top of it here at the Omnibus Podcast. I want to thank everybody for tuning in for the beginning of our 4th season. I hope Walter can join us weekly to do some recaps on legislation and to watch this super fast legislative session, which is, yes, shorter than last year's session by design, because it's supposed to be a part-time job where very few things happen in the second year. Of course, that's not the truth, but we'll see. We'll watch things happen quickly here at the Omnibus Podcast. So thank you very much for joining. And you can, if you're streaming us on Facebook or YouTube, you can also download the podcast on Apple Podcast and about a dozen other places. So thank you for tuning in for another episode of the Omnibus Podcast, where all subjects are germane.